Imagine standing alone against a coalition of dark forces, their intricate schemes and malevolent rituals aimed solely at your downfall. Yet, with unwavering faith and inner strength, you not only withstand their onslaught, but dismantle their entire operation effortlessly. This narrative echoes the timeless biblical theme of light prevailing over darkness, showcasing the profound impact of steadfastness and spiritual authority. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this inspiring story. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more empowering stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The night was heavy, thick with the weight of unseen forces moving in the shadows. The air carried an eerie silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to rise. And then there was you. You didn't ask for this battle. You didn't seek out enemies in the dark corners of the world. But somehow, they had found you. A network of manipulators, deceivers, and practitioners of dark arts had woven an elaborate scheme, believing they could silence your light. They had ruled in secrecy, their power feeding on fear and deception. They were confident, smug even, convinced that no one could stand against them. Until you did. At first, they underestimated you. They had seen many before. Strong men, brilliant minds, courageous leaders, all had fallen to their schemes. Fear, temptation, and manipulation had always been their greatest weapons. But you didn't break. You didn't flinch under their intimidation. You didn't collapse beneath their curses, and that terrified them. One by one, their whispers turned into anxious murmurs. Their confidence cracked. They sent their strongest against you, those who had crushed souls and torn apart destinies. Yet their power dissolved in your presence, like mist before the morning sun. They couldn't understand why, but you knew. It wasn't because you were stronger. It wasn't because you had mastered some secret technique or hidden knowledge. It was because you stood in something greater than yourself. Your strength didn't come from rage or revenge. It came from something untouchable, unbreakable, a power beyond the reach of darkness. They had spent their lives controlling others, feeding off the weak, silencing those who dared to resist. They had perfected their craft. But what happens when control meets someone who cannot be controlled? The answer was written in their fearful eyes. They had believed they were untouchable, that their influence would last forever. But all empires built on lies eventually crumble, and you, simply by existing, became the first crack in their foundation. The game had changed. They knew it, and for the first time, so did you. And this wasn't just about survival. This was war. A war you never wanted. A war you could no longer avoid. But, make no mistake, you would not lose. The air around you was shifting. You could feel it, an unsettling weight pressing against your spirit, like a silent storm brewing on the horizon. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't just fear. It was them. They had taken notice. For so long they had operated in the shadows, weaving their deception, manipulating the weak, and silencing anyone who dared to disrupt their order. But you had walked in and shattered the illusion without even trying, and that made you dangerous. They didn't understand why their intimidation didn't work, why their manipulations failed to take root, why their carefully orchestrated schemes crumbled the moment you stepped into the picture. And so, they watched, waiting, plotting, searching for a weakness. At first, it was subtle, a whisper behind your back, a strange heaviness in the air when you entered a room, familiar faces suddenly turning cold, their eyes clouded with doubt and suspicion. They were testing you. Would you fight back? Would you crumble under pressure? Would you break like all the others before you? But you didn't, and that sent a ripple of fear through their ranks. They realized something far worse than your defiance. Your existence alone was enough to unravel everything they had built. You weren't just another obstacle. You weren't someone they could intimidate into submission. You were a mirror. a reflection of everything they feared. They had spent their lives thriving in secrecy, in deception, in the delicate art of control. But what happens when they are forced into the light? They began to slip. One mistake, then another. Desperation crept in as they scrambled to re-establish control. The people they once manipulated started asking questions. Doubt seeped into the cracks of their carefully constructed world, and that terrified them more than anything else. This wasn't about power anymore. It was about survival, and they knew that as long as you stood, they could never be safe. So they did what they always did when faced with a threat. They prepared for war. But what they didn't realize was that you weren't afraid of the battle, because you already knew the truth. You had already won. It started slowly, like a silent tremor beneath the surface. At first, they dismissed it, a minor disturbance, a ripple in the grand design they had spent years perfecting. But what they failed to realize was that you weren't just a ripple. You were the beginning of the storm. The moment you walked into their world, something shifted. Not because you challenged them openly, not because you waged war with weapons or raised your voice in defiance, but because you existed in a way they couldn't control. And that was enough to dismantle everything they had built. For years, they had ruled through intimidation, silence, and secrecy. They operated like a well-oiled machine, unquestioned, unseen, unchecked. But suddenly, their whispers weren't just whispers anymore. People started to see. The cracks in their empire widened. People who once walked blindly under their influence were now turning their heads, questioning the very foundation of the system they had always accepted. And it wasn't because you forced them to. It was because truth has a way of revealing itself. And you? You were the living embodiment of that truth. They tried to contain the damage. They whispered warnings, tightened their grip, cast their shadows over those who dared to listen. But it was too late. Because once a mind begins to question, it never truly stops. One by one, those who had been blindfolded by deception started to wake up. It was subtle at first, a lingering doubt, a quiet hesitance. But soon it spread like wildfire, and they felt it. The power they had always taken for granted, the influence they had wielded like an unbreakable chain, it was slipping through their fingers. And you didn't have to do anything. You just had to keep standing. That was the greatest threat to them. Not rebellion, not revenge, but resistance, an unshakable presence, a silent force that refused to be moved. They had always counted on fear to keep their empire strong, but now they were the ones afraid. Afraid of what happens when people wake up, afraid of the consequences when the darkness they hid behind was finally pulled into the light. Afraid, because deep down, they knew. Their time was running out. They had always believed that power belonged to those who controlled the most. Control the mind, and you control the person. Control the person, and you control the world. That was the foundation of their empire, and for years it had worked. They moved unseen, pulling the strings of the weak, shaping destinies with whispers and threats. They were untouchable, or so they thought. But then came you. You didn't play by their rules. You weren't influenced by their tactics. You weren't someone they could mold, twist, or manipulate. And that terrified them, because everything they had ever built depended on one thing: control. Yet no matter what they did, no matter what they tried, they couldn't control you. At first, they thought you were simply resistant, maybe stubborn, maybe unaware of the forces working against you. But as time passed, they realized something far worse. You weren't just resisting them. You were operating on a completely different level. A level they couldn't touch. A level where their weapons were useless, their schemes powerless, their whispers empty. They had spent years mastering the art of manipulation. But what happens when manipulation meets someone who refuses to be moved? It falls apart, and that's exactly what was happening. Their spells, meaningless. Their threats, hollow. Their power, dissolving in your presence. They couldn't understand why. They had broken stronger people. They had silenced voices more powerful than yours. Yet here you stood, untouched, unshaken, unmoved. Because your power didn't come from them. It didn't come from fear, from control, from deceit. It came from something greater, something they could never steal. And that was their worst nightmare. They knew that as long as you stood firm, their reign was coming to an end. And so, desperation took hold. They no longer moved in the shadows. Their whispers turned into shouts. Their threats became reckless. Their once calculated moves were now desperate attempts to regain control. But it was too late. Because once true power is revealed, the illusion of control shatters. And in that moment they realized something they had never imagined possible. They had already lost. They had one last hope: fear. For as long as they had existed, it had been their most powerful weapon. Fear had kept people silent. Fear had made the strong bow. Fear had ensured that no one ever challenged them for long. And yet, here you were, untouched by it. They had whispered threats in the dark, trying to plant seeds of doubt in your mind. They had sent people to discourage you, to tell you that standing against them was reckless, foolish, even dangerous. But you didn't move. You didn't shrink back. You didn't waver. And that shook them to their core. They couldn't understand how someone could walk through a storm and not flinch at the thunder. But the truth was simple. You had already made peace with the battle. This wasn't about winning or losing for you. It was about standing in truth. And when someone stands in truth, fear has no grip on them. They tried harder. They threatened your name, your reputation. They spread lies, hoping to isolate you. They used their old tactics, believing that everyone has a breaking point. But the more they tried to break you, the more it became clear that you weren't the one breaking. They were. Their desperation was showing. Their fear was no longer hidden beneath masks of control. The moment their tactics failed, their weakness was exposed. They had built their kingdom on the assumption that fear would always win. But now, they were the ones afraid. Afraid of you. Afraid of the truth you carried. Afraid of the power that was never theirs to control. And that realization destroyed them. Because if one person could stand without fear, then others could too. And once people stopped fearing them, their entire empire would collapse. They weren't just losing power over you. They were losing everything. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for it, studied it, mastered the art of crushing those who stood in their way. They knew how to fight. But what they didn't prepare for, what they never saw coming, was someone who refused to fight on their terms. They wanted you angry. They wanted you reckless. They wanted you to fall into their game, to be consumed by the battle, to strike back in ways they could predict and control. But you didn't. You didn't fight fire with fire. You didn't answer their manipulation with retaliation. You didn't sink to their level. And that changed everything. For so long, they had won, because they dictated the terms of the war. They thrived in chaos, in deception, in turning people against each other. They had convinced themselves that as long as they controlled the battlefield, they could never lose. But you didn't step onto their battlefield. You rose above it, and suddenly they were fighting an enemy they couldn't understand. Every move they made was designed to provoke you, to pull you into their darkness, to make you react. But you didn't take the bait, and with every failed attempt, their frustration grew. They needed you to fight back in anger. They needed you to crumble under the weight of their oppression. They needed you to play by their rules. But instead, you broke their rules just by standing. Because the greatest victory doesn't come from destroying an enemy. It comes from showing them that their power was never real to begin with. And when they finally realized that they had lost, not because you defeated them, but because they could never defeat you, that was the moment their entire empire collapsed. The war was over. At least that's what they told themselves. But deep down, beneath their arrogance and their empty words, they knew the truth. They hadn't won. They had spent their energy, exhausted their weapons, tried every trick in their book. They had called upon every force they knew, conjured every deception, whispered every lie, and yet you were still standing, unbroken, unshaken, unmoved. And that terrified them more than anything else, because they had never fought someone like you before. They had fought rebels. They had fought those who burned with rage and vengeance. They had fought warriors who wanted nothing more than to see them destroyed. But you were different. You weren't fueled by hate. You weren't controlled by anger. You weren't seeking revenge. And that made you unstoppable, because you weren't just here to win a battle. You were here to end the war itself. At first, they didn't understand what was happening. They had expected resistance. They had expected retaliation. They had expected you to fight back with the same weapons they had used against you. But instead, you did something they never anticipated. You took away their power by refusing to need it. You didn't need their approval. You didn't need their validation. You didn't need their fear. And that broke them. Because power only exists when people believe in it. But you didn't believe in their power anymore. And once you stopped believing, so did everyone else. The illusion shattered. The control dissolved. The darkness they had hidden behind for so long was now nothing more than a shadow disappearing in the light of morning. They had spent so much time trying to win, and in the end, they lost. Because they never understood that the real battle was never against you. The real battle was within themselves. They had built their lives on control, but the one thing they could never control was the truth. And now, the truth was everywhere. They had lost, not because you defeated them, but because they were never as powerful as they thought they were. They had always relied on numbers, strength in numbers, power in unity, control through the collective. That was how they thrived. They manipulated groups, created alliances, and turned people against each other. It was their most effective strategy. After all, when people were divided, they were easier to control. But when they came for you, they were confronted with something they had never faced before. You stood alone, not because you were abandoned, not because you were outnumbered, but because you didn't need the crowd to be powerful, and that made you unpredictable. At first, they thought it was a weakness. They believed isolation would break you, that being alone would leave you vulnerable. So, they worked hard to cut you off. They spread lies, turned friends into enemies, and made sure no one stood beside you. They watched, waiting for the moment you would crack, for the fear to set in. But it never came, because solitude didn't weaken you. It made you stronger. While they thrived on chaos, you thrived on clarity. While they needed constant validation, you moved with quiet certainty. While they feared being alone, you found power in it, and that terrified them. Because their entire system depended on the idea that people were nothing without a group. But you were proof that one person can stand against an entire empire and not be moved. They tried to adjust. They changed their tactics, attempting to lure you into their web. They offered deals, tried to bait you with false promises. But it was too late. Because you had already won the greatest battle of all, the battle of the mind. You didn't need their approval. You didn't crave their acceptance. You didn't look to them for permission to exist. And that realization broke them. Because if you, one person, could stand firm without their influence, then others could too. And that meant their empire, which had been built on deception and control, was already falling apart, not with a war, not with violence, not with destruction, but with one simple truth. They never had real power to begin with. They had spent so much time trying to outnumber you, trying to isolate you, trying to break you. They believed that if they applied enough pressure, if they surrounded you with enough doubt, you would eventually bend to their will. But now, as they watched you, standing firm, untouched, unmoved, they realized something that sent chills through their bones. They had never been in control, not of you, not of the people around them, not of anything, because true power had never been in their hands. And for the first time, they saw it. At first, they tried to deny it. They clung to the illusion, telling themselves that this was temporary, that they could still regain control. But deep down, they knew. Something irreversible had happened. They had ruled through fear, but fear had lost its grip. They had thrived in secrecy, but the truth had now come to light. They had depended on deception, but now their masks were slipping and people were beginning to see through them. And nothing terrified them more, because an empire built on lies cannot survive in the presence of truth. And you, just by standing in truth, had become the crack that shattered their foundation. The war they had prepared for, it never happened. There was no battle, no destruction, no uprising. Instead, their entire system collapsed under its own weight, because power built on control is fragile, and once people stop believing in it, it ceases to exist. They looked at you one last time, searching for something, anything, that would give them back the sense of dominance they once had. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The battle was over. Not because you fought harder, not because you overpowered them, but because you never needed their power to begin with. And that was the one truth they never saw coming. They were gone, not in the way they had imagined. There was no grand defeat, no final battle, no dramatic fall. They simply ceased to exist in the way they once did, because the world no longer believed in their power. And when belief is lost, so is control. The weight of their deception had collapsed under the truth. Everything they had built, through manipulation, fear, and secrecy, had unraveled. Not because you tore it down, but because you stood, and that was enough. Enough to expose them, enough to unmask them, enough to show the world that their power was never real to begin with. Now, as the dust settled, something new was emerging. Not another empire, not another system of control, but freedom. Real, undeniable, unshakable freedom. Not the kind they once offered, false, conditional, fleeting, but the kind that comes from truth. The kind that cannot be given or taken away. The kind that only comes from within. And that was the one thing they had always feared the most. Because people who are truly free cannot be controlled. You didn't just win, you changed everything. Not through force, not through vengeance, not through destruction, but through unshakable presence. You proved that darkness only thrives where light is absent, that deception only works when truth is silent, that control only lasts as long as people allow it to. And now, the world will never go back to what it was before, because you existed, because you stood firm, because you refused to bow. And now, the legacy you leave behind isn't just victory. It's a world where no one will ever be ruled by fear again.